since this event is called Crowdsourcing Week, I thought, well, maybe it's good if I stand out from the crowd. So I thought, well, let's wear a tie today, because I guess my audience won't. So I'm the only one with a tie, so that makes me stand out from the crowd. So, did that already. So, what are we going to talk about? A bit about economic growth. Where does growth come from? We all think growth is something which is a law of nature, economic growth. Companies want to have profit growth, want to have turnover growth. Everybody want to see their salaries grow. You want to have mental growth. Psychologically, you want to grow. Everybody wants to grow, but where does growth actually come from? What is the growth that pays for everything, that pays for the roads, the doctors, the scientific breakthroughs, etc.? So that's basically what I wrote a book about. And the whole story, my whole point is basically that, to summarize it very quickly, if you don't have time to read the book, it's very, very easy to remember. It's optimism plus free markets equals progress. I mean, that's what it all boils down to. If you're optimistic and you have an attitude to change things yourself, you think you have a good idea and you're allowed to compete with the powers that be, vested interests, companies which don't have a good product, then you will get growth. That's what ultimately growth comes from optimistic people having a good idea and being able to execute their idea. You say, well, okay, we know this, it's normal. No, it's not. In a lot of regions, countries, you're not allowed to compete with anybody. In Belgium, you're not allowed to start running trains yourselves. The government has a monopoly on operating trains. In Brussels, you're not allowed to build a rival service to the current taxi system because they have the monopoly to the tax system, etc., etc. So that's what I think ultimately growth comes from. Now let's look what growth was like, what growth felt like over the past couple of centuries, millennia. Well, this is what growth looked like over the, let's say, very long-term history of mankind. This is what growth was like. We had no growth for most of history. Growth has been invented around the Industrial Revolution. That's when growth actually started to come about. In short, growth is the number of people around plus how productive they are. Let's assume I have a country and there's one guy working there and he chops down trees with an axe. And he can do 1 tree an hour. That is my total production. If I want to grow the number of trees I can cut down in a year, I either have to make sure there's one, or instead of one, there's 2, 3, 5, or 10,000 people cutting down trees. That will allow me growth of the population. Or growth of productivity, improve technology. Make sure I replace the axe with the chainsaw. Make sure you can cut down more trees in an hour. That's the 2 sources of growth. And we didn't have a lot of growth in this for most of humanity. And that's why Thomas Hobbes, in his book Leviathan, described the state of man in the pre-industrial age as poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That was what life amounted to. So this is what growth looked like for most of history. But things changed over the past 2 centuries. They changed spectacularly. And this is what happened. This one guy was replaced by billions of people on this planet. And this low-tech technology, these low-tech tools were changed by high-tech tools. That's what we call innovation. And both have grown spectacularly. If you look at the end, let's say the 18th century, start of the 19th century, average GDP per person on this planet was $600 per year, per person. And that was like that for the previous 20 centuries. So there was a total stagnation in your living standards. If you were born, you could only hope to be as poor as your father, grandfather, and all the generations before that. And there were, at that point in time, about 600 million people. Now, what happened in the 2 centuries afterwards is the number of people on this planet went times 10, from 600 million to 6 billion, and the average income per person went from 600 a year to 6,000 a year. So total production worldwide went times 100 in 2 centuries. This was unseen in the history of mankind. And this is actually where growth came from. More people around and better productivity, better tools, inventions, machinery, etc. That's ultimately what growth comes from. Now, I'll show you in this chart, you can see actually the same. You see from the birth of Jesus Christ, from the year 1 up to the year 1000, the bold figure is always the average annual growth of the economy. How fast does prosperity grow? And then it's divided into more people, which is more people that are able to cut down trees, which is the blue bar, and then the beige one, which is the evolution of your technology, the axe being replaced by a chainsaw. So what you see, for example, between the birth of Jesus Christ and, let's say, the period when Charlemagne lived, the Middle Ages in Europe, growth was zero. There was no growth at all for the world as a whole. And then you can say, well, we had this fantastic Asian civilization or the Chinese civilization, etc., and they must have progressed, surely. Yes, they did. But at the same point in time, we probably bashed each other's skulls in, and we declined by 20, 30, 40%. So on average, the world did not progress at all. In the Middle Ages, it starts going a bit faster. So we see between the year 1000 and 1500, we progress on average by 0.1% per year, all of which comes from more people cutting down trees. Not better technologies, more people doing the stuff. And then you look what happens around the turn of the start of the 19th century, you see that growth starts exploding. People get healthier, live longer lives, child mortality falls, more people around, better technology, and you get a fantastic growth. This is unseen in the history of mankind. And in the most recent period, you still see that there's growth around 4%, the last two bars, most of which comes from better technology. Populations don't grow that fast anymore. But there's still growth going on in this planet. The only point is, in the West, growth seems to be running out. And that's what I would say, that in the West we're suffering from a stroke. And you know, a stroke, I mean, all of a sudden you get a loss of brain function caused by a blockage or a rupture of a blood vessel to the brain. You get paralyzed, you're in a wheelchair for the rest of your life, you have to undergo treatment or therapy, etc. That's exactly what the West is suffering right now, a stroke. We thought growth was something normal. We thought this continuing source of progress was there to be for forever. Well, this is not the case. Why is this not the case? There's a number of reasons. First of all, we're dying out in Europe. We are dying out. This is the number of people between 15 and 64, the ones doing the work, the ones chopping down the trees, and what happens to this category of people. And in the dark green, you see the people, the decade 2000, 2010, and the light green, it's the decade which we're in right now. So you see, after in Europe we had a growth of population last decade, we're declining right now. And we will do so in next decade and the decade after that. And the same goes for Belgium, the same goes for Germany, for Italy, the Netherlands, and Spain. There's less people around that are able to cut down the trees. Take Germany as an example. Who knows how many Germans are around today? How many Germans do we have living in Germany? Make a wild guess. 80 million, very close. It's about 82 million. That number will fall by 26 million by the end of this century. That's 26 million less consumers, entrepreneurs, workers, people starting a company, etc. Everything east of Germany contracts dramatically. Russia contracts by 40 million. China contracts by 300 million. That's an entire United States that disappears from the population of China. So that's the first one, less people around. Second problem, less productivity around. Replacing the axe by the chainsaw is very simple and yields you an enormous amount of extra productivity. I can do 1 tree an hour if I use an axe. I can do 20 trees an hour if I use a chainsaw. Productivity times 20. But if I want to repeat that same trick, the year later I will have to be forced to do 400 trees an hour, and 1 year later 8,000 trees an hour. You immediately see that there's technical and physical limits to what I can achieve. So you see your productivity growth is structurally going down. So the extra amount of prosperity I can add per hour worked is not growing that fast anymore. When we had the sewer system which we invented, and the internal combustion engine, and the railroads and telegraphs, now that yielded enormous amounts of productivity. People became much more productive. Having LinkedIn on your smartphone doesn't immediately make you enormously more productive. Having Facebook on your smartphone might even make you less productive than if you didn't have it. So looking at, for example, a country like Belgium, your average annual GDP growth, and that's the amount of extra prosperity we add to the economy, has gradually been falling. In the 60s, we grew by 4%, close to 3% in the 70s. It's less than 1% right now. Although society expects growth to be this unending source from which early retirement age and big pensions and eternal holidays come from, well, this is not going to be the case. Growth is slowly withering in the West. So it's a bit like this. So the engine that we thought could support all this social system and all this welfare and these roads and hospitals and whatever, it's basically breaking. It cannot support this weight anymore. So either we have to get some weight off the cart, or we have to reinforce the car. We have to reinforce the truck, and that's exactly what we want to do. So what does the future hold? What do we have to do to get this growth? By the way, does anybody have any idea which painting style this is? I'll give you one hint. It's not Impressionism, and it's not Expressionism either. Which painting style is this? Very close. It's not Futurism. It's Retrofuturism. The thing is, if somebody in the 1950s would have made this, it would have been Futurism. This has actually been made last year. It's a picture of somebody imagining somebody in the 50s, imagining what the 2000s would look like. That's called retrofuturism. So what does the future hold? How do we go from stroke to master stroke? Outstanding piece of strategy, skill, talent to actually transform our plight into renewed prosperity. First of all, more individual freedom. You've been talking about this at length probably about the platform economy, the platform industry, etc. The Uberization of the economy, that's exactly what is going to lead to more prosperity. With platforms like Uber, people can actually start leading their own lives again. Who knows TaskRabbit? Okay, most of you do. I'll explain for the ones who don't know it. So basically, you have people coming over tonight for dinner. You still need to go pick up your groceries, pick up a table at IKEA. Your lawn still has to be mowed, and you don't want to do it yourself. So you put these tasks on a virtual notice board, and people, you say, I give $20 for this, $10 for that, and then people report themselves to do these tasks for you. This kind of economy is basically one in which people start leading their own lives again. People are not drones, or people do not belong to the Borg or something like that. People are individuals. And this platform economy facilitates people's individualism. So let's say you have a bookkeeper who is good at cooking Italian food and who likes to do gardening. In a couple of years' time, with a couple of platforms, he could go do bookkeeping for 3 days in a week for a certain company. 2 days a week he goes helping out in a restaurant, and in the weekend he does gardening at a certain place. And the week later, his schedule looks totally different. This is exactly what can give us more growth, more individual freedom for people. More free market. Who knows what kind of bus this is? I don't want to know the type or the brand, but it's a Greyhound bus. Indeed, you have transportation between cities in the US. Well, up to a couple of months ago, this was outlawed in a country like France. If you operated a bus between Paris and, let's say, Marseille, back and forth as a private company, this was illegal. And why was that the case? Because then you would be competition for the National Railroad, which is a government-owned company, so this is not supposed to happen. You're not supposed to compete with the government. What was allowed, though, was a bus leaving from Warsaw in Poland, going to Barcelona, stopping in Paris, stopping in Marseille, having people board the bus in Paris, leave the bus in Marseille. So that was allowed on condition that there's not more than 20% French people on the bus. If it did, then it was outlawed as well. So that rule was scrapped. And you see that if you keep people from competing with what they think is the best idea, you don't get the best ideas. Competition leads to better ideas. For smartphones, I mean, Samsung and Apple are basically fighting a battle to death over who has the most users and who has the most clients. It's because they compete so fiercely that you get the best smartphone after all. That is what gets the best products and the best ideas to the market. Research and development, very important. We don't innovate, we don't research enough in Europe. What I show here is a map showing the amounts of patents which are filed each year for intellectual property rights in Europe as well as the US. In Europe, per million inhabitants, we have about 100 patents that are filed every year. In the US, you have close to 400. That's 4 times as much. Simple calculus, 4 times as much. But the thing is, of course, a lot of these patents in the US will sometimes be stupid patents. I mean, the ones who've taken domestic flights in the US know that there's this big book in the, you can find in the seat in front of you, which is called Sky Mall, with all these novelties like a vacuum cleaner that's being operated by your dog, etc. But maybe sooner or later that inventor meets somebody else and they make the new iPhone or the new whatever. You need this turnover in ideas, this liquidity of ideas to come up with the best ideas. If you then look at where do we innovate in Europe, so that's the dark blue regions. It's the regions in which basically there's more than 250 patents per million inhabitants. Well, that's around Munich, that's around that's Bavaria, it's Eindhoven, it's Stockholm, it's Helsinki, it's around Paris, 6, 7 regions we consider like world-class in innovation. In the US, 3/4 of all states are big Bavarias, big Eindhovens, Stockholms, or Helsinki. So we need to move much more research and development and much more innovation. To give you one final example, in the Netherlands you have 400 patents per million inhabitants, in Belgium 180, Spain 60, Greece 3, and Albania 0. That is what growth ultimately comes from. There's a number of things we should do: remove barriers to competition in the service sector, focus on a much more efficient and effective government, R&D, more free markets. I mean, those are the enablers we actually need. And we need much more of the guy on the right and much less of the guy on the left. The guy on the left is John Maynard Keynes. He said if there's no growth in the economy, the government should step in and they should provide growth. Well, it doesn't happen like that. I believe much more in the guy on the right, who's called Joseph Schumpeter, who believed in creative destruction. Old industries, sectors, companies disappear and new ones appear. And if you don't allow the destruction of old ones, you will never get the creation of new ones. So in a nutshell, where can we still find growth? It comes from innovation. How can you get innovation? By educating people, by allowing companies to compete. If you have a good idea, you should be allowed to compete, whether it's a government enterprise, etc. Compete. More people having a job, more freedom, more free markets, and a good attitude. And that's what I think we will get growth from. Thank you very much.